Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today an episode of IEMs, and I want to say a huge thanks to the viewer that suggested that name for my future IEM battles. So we've had King of the Cans in the past, I did try IEM Hero, but now we've got IEMs. I'm keen to know which you prefer. Do you like IEM Hero or do you like IEMs better? Let me know in the comments down below and I'll start to use whatever term most people seem to like as my future label for battles of IEMs. But for today, let's try out IEMs and see how it goes. Today's battle is specifically between planar magnetic IEMs. I've got 4 planar magnetic IEMs here, ranging from $150 through to $340 US. I'll introduce them in a moment, but just in case you don't really care about planar magnetic IEMs, I'm not only going to talk about these in the context of planars. Of course, I'm going to compare them against each other and decide which ones I think are better, but at the same time, I've also got a couple of other guest appearances to help put these into context with some other very well-known IEMs on the market. But we'll get to that later. For now, let me introduce the contenders for the planar magnetic IEMs. I'll introduce these in the order of price, and that means we're going to start with the very new to the market, Shuoer S12. First of all, I want to extend my thanks to Accessory Audio for sending me the S12 for review. It's only just arrived, it's the newest of the bunch here, and as you'll hear later, it's definitely an IEM that a number of you are going to want to check out. The S12 is a unique collaboration between Accessory Audio and Shuoer as I understand it, and it comes in at just $149 US. So as I said, it's the cheapest of this bunch. Going up in price, the next IEM is the TinHiFi P1 Plus. This retails for $169 US, and I'd like to thank Linsol for sending me this one for review. Many of you will be familiar with the P1 and the P2, but in particular the P1 was kind of one of the first, if not the first, major planar magnetic IEM on the market. I never heard the P1, but I've got the P2 and we'll be talking about it here today. And I know that some people felt there were a few issues with the tuning and the overall presentation of the P1. So the P1 Plus, of course, is designed to address some of those, and I'll share my views shortly as to whether or not I think they've done a good job in creating a good sounding IEM with the P1 Plus. Before we get to the details though, let's introduce the third option here, and that's the very popular, fairly highly hyped 7Hz timeless IEM. This one retails for $220 US, so it's a fairly significant step up from the S12 and the P1 Plus. And again, I want to say thank you to Linsol for sending me this one for review. I know a lot of you have been waiting a very long time for me to share my review of the 7Hz timeless. I've had lots of other products in the queue, so firstly, thank you for your patience. And secondly, if you do want to know exactly when every review in my schedule is coming out, then you can join the Passion for Sound family over on Patreon and get access to my full review calendar. Occasionally, I will slip in surprise reviews that not even the patrons know are coming. But for the most part, depending on the tier you join, you have full visibility of every single review that I have planned, often 6 months in advance. On top of that, you can then ask me questions about the product before they ever get to review. I've had lots of conversations in the Discord server with a number of patrons in relation to the 7Hz timeless, and so they probably already know a fair bit of what I'm going to say. Not everything, but a fair bit. So if that's of interest to you, don't forget to check out the links down below over to Patreon. I'd love to see you join the Passion for Sound family. We've got a great community growing and chatting away on Discord and on Patreon itself, so do come and join me over there if it's of interest to you. But moving on, let's talk about our fourth planar magnetic contender here, and that's an IEM I've already mentioned in the TinHiFi P2. This is clearly the most expensive headphone of the bunch at $340, that's US dollars still, and that means it's a very significant jump in price. It's a full $120 more than the 7Hz timeless, and so I was particularly interested to see how it stacked up against the newer and cheaper competition. So without any further delay, let's jump in and see if we can find out which of these planar magnetic IEMs is the planar magnetic IEMs. Now, in order to cut straight to the chase and talk about sound quality on these IEMs, I'm going to skate over a lot of the other accessory and build quality details, but I do want to highlight a few key differences between these and generally state that all of them come pretty well accessorized. The number of tips you receive, the specific quality, the cables, everything varies a little bit, but there's not a single one of these IEMs in this entire roundup that I think is anything less than well accessorized. Now just quickly, it's a really windy night here in Melbourne tonight, so if you do hear any noise in the background, I apologise if it gets distracting. I'll do my best to remove it when I edit this video. But moving on, the key differences that I want to flag here is a really quick run through of the fact that we've got two of these IEMs have 4.4mm cables as I received them. Now some of these you can choose the cables you get, others come exactly as they are here. So in the case of the 7Hz timeless, you can choose the cable. I've got the 4.4mm balanced here. For the P1 Plus, I've got the 3.5mm single-ended cable. The P2, I've got a 2.5mm cable. I believe that's the only way this one comes, or at least how it came when I got it, and that therefore comes with a couple of adapters to go from 2.5mm balanced to 4.4mm or 3.5mm single-ended. And so in that regard, the P2 is probably the best accessorized of the bunch, but having said that, its tip selection isn't as strong as something like the timeless. So there are variations, but none of them are disappointing in any area, and that's why I'm not putting too much emphasis into any of the accessories here. The final IEM in front of me here is the Shuoer S12, and that also comes with the 4.4mm balanced cable. They all come with some version of serviceable carry case, and as I've already mentioned, the tip selection is also solid across the board. If I had to pick a winner for overall accessories, it probably comes down to the timeless because of the range of tips available, because tips are a really key part of getting the right fit and sometimes the right sound, and the timeless comes with a really good selection. The P1 Plus and the S12 also have a solid range of tips with them, but I think the timeless probably just edges out on quality and variety overall. But basically, I'm going to call it a draw across the board for accessories, cables, general features and functions. Now, having just mentioned that they all have different tips, they've all got different connector types on the cables, I want to make it clear how I've done all of my testing for this review. Whilst I've listened to these over a period of time from all sorts of different devices, when it came time to do my direct comparisons and write up my listening notes, I did exactly the same thing for every single IEM in this comparison. And that is, I used the Chord Mojo with the Chord Poly as my source, so I had a consistent, high-quality portable source. That also means that all of them were using single-ended connections, so there's no benefit being balanced or single-ended. And then finally, I used the same tips on every single IEM for all of my testing. For me, that meant the JVC spiral dots because they give me a really consistent and solid fit. But the most important thing was it meant a consistent insertion depth and a consistent tip influence on the sound. So I leveled the playing field and I compared these IEMs. Let me share with you what I heard. As I often do, I'm going to start with the cheapest model and work my way up, but I'm going to save the winners and losers of the IEM per battle until we get a little bit later through the video. So for now, let me just give you some general impressions, and I'm going to start with the Shuoer S12. The S12 has a 16 ohm, 102 decibel sensitivity planar magnetic driver, and that makes it very, very easy to drive. Overall, I'd describe the S12 as an incredibly enjoyable listen with a fairly balanced overall signature. It's a fun and engaging signature despite being balanced. So when I say balanced, I don't mean necessarily that it's a purely neutral signature in the sense that it measures dead flat. What I mean is that it's a signature with no major peaks and troughs in the sounds. So there's not a huge bass emphasis or treble emphasis or anything like that. Everything balances pretty well with everything else. Having said that, there is one slight bit of emphasis, and I mean it's very slight. It's not a drastic shift, and that's why I'm saying that overall the frequency response is fairly balanced. It's not perfectly balanced, and that's because there's this very slight emphasis in the upper mids and lower treble. What that means is that certain sounds are just slightly, ever so slightly, over-enhanced from the S12. The end result is that some instruments can sound a little bit unnatural at times, and not in a bad way, but just in a way that you can hear that there's been something added to the sound. One example was listening to All at Sea by Jamie Cullum. The piano in that track was just a little bit too percussive. I could hear a little bit too much of the hammers hitting the strings, and it was not quite natural compared to how it would sound listening to a live piano. As is often the case though, these things are kind of double-edged swords, because that same little bit of emphasis that can make things sound a touch unnatural also makes the S12 very interesting and exciting to listen to. It never makes them fatiguing because it's been done very tastefully and in a range of frequencies that's not sibilant or harsh. And so instead you get this lovely sense of clarity and detail from the S12s that's excellent and enjoyable to listen to. So you're trading off a little bit of naturalness for a great sense of fun and excitement in the music. The bass from the S12 is extremely present, well extended, and it's got a good sense of thump and rumble when you need it. Listening to that same track I just mentioned, All at Sea by Jamie Cullum, the kick bass via the S12 has a great sense of impact and body to it, but it's still very controlled and tight. And I think that's because the S12 relies more on bass extension rather than bass emphasis. So all of the bass frequencies are well represented all the way down to the sub bass, and it gives it that presence and that thump that's very enjoyable but never over-colouring the sound. Finally, talking about the mid-range briefly, the mids are a tiny bit dry due to that upper mid-range lower treble emphasis that I've already mentioned, but it's not bad in any way. It's just got that slight extra sense of clarity that can make things just a little bit less smooth and sometimes a little bit lacking in the richness that you might want from a deeper vocal. The spatial qualities of the S12 are a little bit more of a mixed bag. I found the imaging from them very interesting, but it's kind of hard to nail down if it's good or not so good. What I mean by that is that vocals and instruments are fairly nicely placed, they're relatively well focused, but there's not a huge amount of space in the overall soundstage. The width from the S12 is okay, but it doesn't tend to get outside the head too much, so it's mostly trapped with inside the head and it hasn't got a huge amount of depth. And that's why I think the imaging and the soundstage is a little bit mixed, because the focus and the clarity of the image is quite good, but the sense of space that it has to work in is somewhat limited. It's not congested or bad, it's just not an amazing sense of soundstage and imaging. But for now, I'm just going to say the S12 has really impressed me, and that made it really interesting to put it up against what we have to come yet in the rest of these contenders. So let's move up a notch now in price and talk about the TinHiFi P1 Plus. With a 22 ohm, 108 decibel sensitivity driver, these are even easier to drive than the S12s. And yet I found myself turning the volume up, not down. And that's quite telling, I think, because it's actually a clue to the frequency response and the tuning of the P1 Plus. The P1 Plus is a more neutral tuning in the sense that it sounds a bit leaner and a little bit more clinical. Now, I'm not going to try and say here which one is more accurate or true to source, because that would rely on me knowing exactly what the test tracks are meant to sound like. What I will say though is that people that traditionally look for what's probably called neutral most of the time are probably going to find the P1 Plus to be closer to what they're looking for. The S12, on the other hand, is more akin to what people are going to think of as being a bit more fun, a little bit richer, and a little bit bassier. For me, I find the S12 to sound a bit more natural, albeit with a little bit of enhancement, but it does come down to your tastes and your expectations. Another key difference I noted going from the S12 to the P1 was that the P1 lacks a sense of dynamics. It hasn't got the engagement and the energy that the S12 has, and I don't mean just in terms of having more bass in the S12, I mean the actual attack and the energy across the whole frequency range. The P1 feels very restrained and even sometimes just a little bit blunted. One thing that's also for sure is that the tuning of the P1 is much more mid and treble focused, and it is a little bit bass shy. It's an IEM that's not going to suit people that like to kind of rock and groove along with the music. One of my favourite tracks for testing that out is AC/DC's Can't Stand Still, which is very aptly named because through the right pair of headphones or earphones, it's very hard to not tap your foot and bob your head along with that one. But with the P1 Plus, it wasn't particularly engaging. It wasn't a bad listen, but it didn't draw me in to the emotion and the groove of the track. The staging from the P1 was a bit stronger than what I found from the S12. It's a bit more open, it's a bit more spacious, and the image was just a little bit better focused as well. So for me, that's a strong point of the P1. It does produce a nice image. It's not a huge soundstage, but the image has a bit more space than the S12, and the focus and instrument separation is all very good. Ultimately, I think for people seeking a slightly reserved, slightly leaner sounding earphone that's a bit more focused on mids and treble rather than bass, I do think the P1 is a very good potential choice. Personally, it's not an earphone that I gravitate towards, but I definitely respect what it does, and I think it's going to suit some people really, really well. As I said before, we'll get to exact comparisons and rankings in just a moment, but first we've got to run through the final two contenders. And that brings us to the 7Hz Timeless. As I said at the beginning, this has been a really, really hyped earphone. Lots of people are claiming it's the best thing since sliced bread, and that always has me wondering a little bit myself whether it's actually as good as they say. The Timeless is a 15 ohm, 104 decibel sensitivity IEM, and once again that means it's very easy to drive. So to this point, every IEM we've looked at here is an IEM you can run off any dongle on the market, any phone for that matter, if it's got a 3.5mm output. I would recommend getting a dongle for maximum sound quality, but at the same time, the power is not going to be an issue. These things need literally a couple of milliwatts, maybe 4 to 5 milliwatts to get dangerous levels of sound. So don't feel like you need full-size portable amplifiers or even a desktop amp for these. They are very simple to drive. Upon listening to the 7Hz Timeless, I immediately understood what the hype was about. These are a wonderful, wonderful sounding IEM. The sound signature, much like the S12, is what I consider to be really well balanced. You've got a good mixture of bass and mids and treble. There's a little bit of spice added to the treble, but it's not as much as the S12, so it doesn't overbalance in quite the same way. The bass is deep and impactful, and I'll compare it later to the S12 just to draw a bit of contrast there. But perhaps the most impressive thing for the S12 for me was its sense of imaging. It creates this lovely expansive image and a nice sense of focus and separation of instruments. This is an earphone that for me, you can put in, close your eyes, and really get lost kind of wandering around the musical mix. I really thoroughly enjoy them for that. Each individual sound, each instrument within the Timeless is delivered as well with this lovely balance of presence and weight, but never any bloat or an over-enhancement in any way. Somehow the Timeless is able to deliver richness where it's appropriate, but also texture where it's appropriate too, and blending the two together where necessary. There wasn't a single instrument I listened to through the Timeless where I ever felt like things were off. Everything just sounded right. There was the right amount of detail, the right amount of richness, the right amount of presence, the right amount of air. It was just a really enjoyable experience every time I plugged them in. Ultimately, the Timeless is an IEM that constantly has impressed me. As I mentioned before, every now and again, it does have just a little bit of extra treble, but that could partly come down to my tip choice. I haven't done any tip rolling. I haven't even really played with the stock tips. And therefore it might be that it just needs the tip choice, and in fact I'd almost put money on the fact that it just needs the right tips, and that little tiny bit of treble spiciness would disappear and make these very near the perfect tuning for me. But I don't want to get ahead of myself yet here because I haven't done the thorough comparisons. These are all the notes I made listening just to each individual IEM in isolation. And as you might have noticed in some of my other reviews, it's when we get to the comparisons that sometimes things get shuffled around a little bit, things get a bit more context, and the black and white becomes a bit more grey. And so to help get us to those comparisons, let's wrap up with a quick talk about the P2s. I've actually previously reviewed the P2s here on the channel, and I did have some mixed thoughts, but I revisited them anyway as part of this planar magnetic battle to see just how they sat in contrast with some of these. The P2 are a 32 ohm, 90 decibel sensitivity, so all of a sudden we do have an IEM that is much more difficult to drive. That doesn't mean they need a desktop amplifier to drive them, it just means that some of the weaker dongles on the market you might be maxing out to get them up to the right levels. So yes, you need a slightly stronger dongle, yeah I said that, to get more out of the P2s, but at the same time they need less than 90 milliwatts in order to listen to them effectively. In fact, they've got a maximum power rating of 90 milliwatts, so you don't want to push them much past that anyway. So as I said, give them a moderately powered dongle and you're completely fine with the P2s. What you'll then hear is that the P2 has a lot in common with the P1 Plus. Or actually I should say the P1 Plus has a lot in common with the P2 because the P2 came out first. What that means is they've got that similar, slightly kind of blunted sound. Things are just a little bit muted from the P2. It's not bad. It's not in any way obnoxious, but you do hear a difference comparing, say, the Timeless and the S12 with something like the P2 or the P1 Plus. I do still find the P2s to be an enjoyable listen, but in my mind there's no doubt that their tonality isn't entirely natural, and sometimes a slightly unnatural sound can still be enjoyable, and I do believe that's true for the P2. The most obvious thing for me in the P2's tuning is that the mid-range comes across just a little bit lacking in weight. It's like they've been tuned to give more emphasis on texture and less emphasis on the richness and the weight of the sound. As part of that, the treble can be a little bit over-enhanced, and they can come across as just a tiny bit tinny sometimes. In my original review of these, I tried them with the foam tips, and I found them much better with the foam, so do keep that in mind. But as I said, for this review, I wanted to do everything with the same tips so as not to muddy the waters, trying to optimize tips across different IEMs, and therefore changing what you might experience because every tip brand is a little bit different. What you're going to be able to take away from this review by keeping it consistent is you'll get a sense of which IEM is closer as a starting point to what you're looking for, and then you know that you can make a 3, 4, 5% tweak by choosing the tips that are going to take it in the direction that you want it. So wrapping up the P2 now, keeping in mind the tips that I'm using, the JVC spiral dots. The final things I wanted to mention is that I do find them a little bit shy on the bass, but with all that said, they are still an enjoyable earphone. If I was just to put them on, relax, and listen to the music, there's nothing at all wrong with the P2s. When I'm listening critically to them, they're not as natural sounding as some other IEMs, but there's nothing inherently bad about them either. And so this all brought me to a rather interesting place. What I started to realise at this point was that there are actually two different sets of IEMs to compare here. We've got one set which are more warm, rich, what I consider a more natural sound, not overly enhanced in the bass, but with the right amount of bass to sound natural and rich throughout the frequency range. Those IEMs were the 7Hz timeless and the Shuoer S12. And then for those of you that prefer a leaner, more mid-treble type oriented sound, that brought me to a comparison of the P1 Plus and the P2. You've got the old flagship and the newly upgraded, more budget IEM. But being upgraded, I was interested to see if it was now better or equivalent to the more expensive P2. What I've also added to this mix is a contextual IEM for each of those two comparisons. In the case of the richer, warmer sounds, I've got the Ikko OH10, and in the case of the more lean sounding IEMs, I've got the Moondrop KATO. I started off this battle comparing the leaner, more mid and treble focused IEMs. So that's the P2, the P1 Plus, and the Moondrop KATO. For this test, the key track that I used for making all my notes after some general listening was Call My Name by Prince. I happened to have the P2 in my ear when I came around to this track and decided to sit with that, and what I immediately heard from the P2 was just how well it focused Prince's vocals front and center in the mix. The piano during the intro stage had this beautiful sense of kind of ethereal, magic, upper register clarity to it that was just really beguiling. On the other hand, the drums sounded a little bit weightless and a little bit lifeless. There was no presence or body from the P2 to give them the substance the drums probably need to have. When the bass guitar came in, it was clean, well-defined, well-controlled, but it did lack a bit of presence. The occasional note had a little bit of rumble and a little bit of kind of weight to it, but for the most part, I did feel like the bass was lacking. So the P2s delivered some real magic in the upper registers and around the vocals, but the overall mix was not entirely satisfying for me. Moving to the P1s, everything was brought a little bit closer to me. That brought a lovely sense of intimacy and actually connected me a little bit better with the music. The P1s also delivered just a little bit more weight in the drums, and it helped them sound a touch more lifelike, but they were still lacking in presence and weight overall. The vocals that I mentioned before as being so beautifully focused from the P2s were now not quite as well focused, but on the flip side of that, in some ways they were a bit more connected to the rest of the mix. I'm not going to say if one was better or worse. The P2 was a really interesting listen. It was a unique presentation that immediately grabbed my attention. But in some ways the P1 was probably the more musically coherent sound. So both had their benefits, both had their drawbacks. Likewise, the piano that I mentioned before at the beginning of the track with that wonderful ethereal higher register harmonics from the P2, from the P1 that was again less separated and less focused for me in the mix. That meant it was more coherent within the mix, but I did lose a little bit of the magic that the P2 had. Where all this left me is that I actually think the P1 is probably the better overall balanced frequency response of these two earphones, but it does come at the cost of less moments of magic. The greater enhancement in the P2's upper registers and treble means that when you get those sweet spots, they are very, very sweet. On the P1, most things are going to sound a bit more natural and a bit more lifelike, but you won't get as many of those moments of magic. And so at this point, I was having a really hard time separating which of these I would choose. Given the price differential, I think I'd probably choose the P1 Plus. But before I locked anything in, I wanted to see what happens if you look outside of planar magnetics and instead go for the Moondrop KATO. I'm a big fan of the KATOs, and when I plugged them in and listened to Call My Name again, all of a sudden it sounded the way I expected. The KATOs for me are still just a little bit lighter weight in the bass than I'd like them to be, but it was definitely a much more natural and balanced overall sound from bass all the way through treble listening to the KATOs compared to the P1 Plus or the P2. The vocals are still nicely focused and textured. The piano still has a lovely sense of clarity and resonance to it. It's still not quite as magical as the P2 got at times, but at the same time, it's better overall balanced within the overall mix. Most importantly for me is that now, in addition to the piano and the vocal sounding great, now also the bass guitar and the drums have the right sense of presence and weight behind them. As I said, I probably would still like just a little bit more to make it more lifelike, but I certainly wouldn't complain at all about the KATO's overall balance. And so for me, to sum all these up, the KATO is definitely the most balanced, best performing of the three of these IEMs in my opinion. The P2 does still have those moments of magic, and therefore there are going to be some people that have this in their collection just for very specific genres, recordings, albums, etc. The P1 sits somewhere in between. It's a bit more lean, it's a bit more focused on the mids and treble compared to the KATOs. And so for some, it's going to be a better mid-ground between what I would consider a properly balanced IEM with bass through treble all well and balanced. It's going to sit somewhere between those and the more bright-leaning, overly treble-oriented IEMs where the P2 is starting to head. So ultimately, I'd say none of these are bad, but I don't think any of these are going to earn the crown of IE Emperor. And so that led me on to my other group of comparisons in the more rich, warm, and dynamic-sounding IEMs. For this set of comparisons, we've got the Shuoer S12 and the 7Hz Timeless, and I've put those up against a non-planar magnetic reference point for contextualization in the form of the Ikko OH10. I'm a huge fan of the OH10, so it was a really tough battle for these to go up against, but I was keen to see just how well these planar magnetics performed. The track I ended up landing on for my direct comparison notes, again after some other listening, was Alibi by David Gray. At the time it came on, I happened to have the OH10s in my ears, and that's where I started. This track opens with some strings, it's a full orchestral arrangement, and from the OH10s I noticed that the strings came across a little bit muted. Everything sounded like it was lacking just a bit of bite from the OH10s. When the vocals and piano kicked in, they sounded absolutely wonderful, and the vocals were beautifully focused from the OH10s. There's a cello that comes in from memory off to the right of soundstage fairly early on in the track, and I felt like from the OH10s I wanted just a little bit more texture. I actually wrote in my notes that I felt like maybe the OH10 needed just a tiny bit more upper mid-range energy. When the bass kicks into the track though, there was no extra energy required there. It had a beautiful sense of rumble and presence to it. It didn't sound overdone at all, just really, really present bass. Overall, the sound from the OH10 on this track was very spacious, smooth and enjoyable. Maybe not entirely natural, but definitely very, very enjoyable. So as I said, it was going to be a very hard act to follow when I switched over to the Shuoer S12. But the Shuoer S12 took it all in its stride. It was immediately clear that the S12s were up to the task, but what was also interesting was knowing that the S12s have a bit too much clarity and that upper treble emphasis sometimes. The strings that I said sounded muted from the OH10, they still sounded a bit muted from the S12, which told me that it was the recording at play and not the OH10s that were falling short of the mark. Even with that little bit of extra emphasis from the S12s, those strings still sounded muted, so I stopped really thinking about those too much as an indicator of performance. As you'd expect, with the emphasis that I've mentioned for the S12, the sound from them comes across just a little bit more articulate compared to the OH10s. And that's because the leading edges of notes are just a little bit crisper. So everything's just got a little bit more kind of energy, articulation to it, which is very enjoyable, again, even if it's not entirely natural. David Gray's vocals on this track from the S12 have a bit more texture, but they lack a bit of the richness that I think is actually right and necessary for the playback. The S12 wasn't bad, but I just missed a little bit of the magic that was in the OH10 rendition. That cello that I mentioned before now had a bit more texture and clarity from the S12, but it came at the cost of a bit of resonance and a bit of richness. So the OH10 tends a little bit more towards euphony. And what I mean by that, the term euphonic is just enjoyable to the ears is what that means. So the OH10 does lean towards making things more enjoyable, but that sometimes means it's also a little bit less natural. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. I don't think either of these two IEMs are the last word in natural sound, but they're both relatively close and have their own elements that are adding a bit of enjoyment to the sound. The final couple of things that I want to mention that really stood out to me is that when the bass came in on the S12s, the bass that I heard really rumble on the OH10, it didn't have quite the same rumble from the S12, but it was still very present and very well controlled. Those of you that really enjoy a deep bass rumble will probably prefer the OH10 over the S12, but the S12 is definitely no slouch. The final point of separation that was very clear between these two is that the S12, because of that upper mid-range emphasis, does deliver a little bit more detail through the mids. It draws your attention more to things like fingers sliding along fretboards, or the sound of fingers plucking at guitars, or the pick hitting the guitar for a strum. Those sorts of things are going to come forward more in the S12, and that's again a double-edged sword. Sometimes it makes it more exciting and engaging, but it can also be a bit distracting and take you away from the actual overall musical picture. And so at the end of this comparison, I was really torn between the OH10 and the S12. I think both are excellent IEMs, and if you ask me which one you should choose, the only way I could answer it is that it's going to come down to whether you want the richer, slightly bassier sound, or whether you want the slightly more detailed and clarity-focused sound of the S12. But both are excellent IEMs, particularly in their price points. And so now it comes time to test the hype. Does the 7Hz Timeless and my excellent first impressions of it, does that stack up to two outstanding IEMs in the OH10 and the S12 here? Restarting Alibi and listening again, what I heard was piano perfection in the opening. Those strings I mentioned before, they were still muted. We know that's in the recording now, but the piano was just perfect. It had the mixture of percussive, rhythmic quality and rich harmonics that a piano should have. The vocal delivery was like a perfect midpoint between the OH10 and the S12, in that it had more texture than the OH10, but was still beautifully focused and had a sense of richness and presence behind it that the S12 fell just a little bit short of. That cello I've mentioned a couple of times, that was also perfectly balanced. It had texture and it had presence. It had richness and harmonics. In fact, at this point, the 7Hz Timeless to me was sounding pretty close to the perfect IEM. The drums sound amazingly natural and true to life. The bass is present and solid. Again, it doesn't quite rumble like the OH10, but it's lacking absolutely nothing. It's controlled, it's tight, but it's got presence and weight behind it. From the Timeless, I could hear the details in the mix that I could hear from the S12, but they weren't pushed forward at me. I was able to hear them if I wanted to, and they were right there. I didn't have to go hunting for them, but they weren't distracting in the way that they sometimes were from the S12. Where I landed on this comparison is that the Timeless is a slightly less euphonic version of the OH10, and also probably a slightly better balanced overall earphone. It doesn't have quite the treble peak of the OH10, and the bass isn't quite as enhanced, which on bassier tracks can sometimes be a shortcoming of the OH10. So for me, as I've already said, the OH10 might just be the perfect earphone at the price. Now that doesn't mean there's not better earphones out there. I did do a bit of listening to some higher level IEMs, and certainly if you spend more money, you can get more refinement in the sound. But what's really important is I don't think you can go too much better in terms of overall frequency balance when you're listening to the Timeless. The Timeless just balances everything beautifully. Some people may find it too rich and warm. I think it's a very natural sound, but for some, it's not going to be a ruler flat, kind of neutral lean sound that some people want. For me though, where I'm pursuing more of a natural, lifelike presentation, I think the Timeless absolutely nails it. So as I said, you can spend more and improve refinement, detail retrieval, maybe soundstage space and imaging, although it's very good in that regard, but I don't think you're going to find many better IEMs when it comes to the overall frequency response balance. So at this point, I'm going to wrap things up with what is probably now a fairly obvious conclusion, and that is to very comfortably crown the 7Hz Timeless as the IE Emperor, both in terms of its performance as a planar magnetic IEM up against the other three contenders I had here, but also for $220, I'm yet to hear a better IEM. Now that doesn't mean it's not out there. I continue to go hunting for new and interesting IEMs to try, but for now, I think the 7Hz Timeless is an absolute winner and I would highly recommend it. While we're wrapping things up, I also think the S12 is absolutely brilliant at its $150 price tag. If you can't afford to go up to $220 and you're looking for a brilliant, enjoyable, engaging IEM, you should absolutely be checking out the S12. It's fantastic, it's comfortable, beautifully made, and a great listen. Finally, I don't want to shun the P1 Plus and the P2 here. I can see them both having a place. They're both nice sounding IEMs. They didn't capture the full musical experience for me like the other two, but for those of you looking for a different colour in the sound, maybe something that's a bit leaner in the bass to allow you to listen more to the mid-range and the treble, I do think the P1 Plus and the P2 are good choices, but if I had to choose between the two, I'd choose the P1 Plus. It's cheaper, I think it's actually got a slightly better overall frequency response, and it's going to be easier to tweak it just a little bit with tips, whereas the P2, by being a bit more extreme in its tuning, is probably going just a little bit too far. And so I'm going to sort of push the P2 aside, partly because it's older, partly because it's more expensive, significantly more expensive than anything else here, and rank these according to my preference here, with the 7Hz Timeless as the IE Emperor Planar Magnetic IEM, and then the S12 followed by the P1 Plus. So that's my ranking of these IEMs. If you've listened to all three, or maybe a couple of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. As always, I hope you found the review useful. If you're interested in picking any of these up, I will put links down below through to the retailers that have provided them where relevant. And so I'd ask that if you are looking to buy them, please do use those links. Say thank you to those retailers for sending me these IEMs. These are affiliate links in this case, so I will receive a small percentage of any sales made. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but it's a great way to say thank you to the retailers, and I deeply appreciate any and all income that those sales generate to help me keep the channel ticking along. Speaking of that, if you've enjoyed this review, I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button, the notification bell, and the like button. It goes a long way to helping me continue to make these videos, and I'm forever grateful. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.